thank you for twice in a week sitting down with us to do this. We did a panel earlier this week at an AI conference where I was surprised when we asked the audience who is for this bill, who's against it, and who doesn't really know what it's actually all about. Hundreds of people, basically everybody there, said they didn't actually know what the bill is not, et cetera. So we really want to make sure people understand what this is doing. So this bill, you've said, is aimed at regulating companies that spend $100 million or more training AI models or $10 million fine-tuning them. Explain how you set those thresholds and why.
Sure, and I will say that at that conference where you had people raise their hands, and the vast majority of people did not raise their hand pro or con, and these are tech people. It's another lesson that we all need to sometimes get off of Twitter into the real world, because Twitter is not reflective of the real world.
Are you sure? Are you sure?
So the bill, what it applies to AI models where the developer of the model is spending more than $100 million to train the model, and that will scale up with inflation, and also where the size of the model is at least 10 to the 26th flop. And so if you are a covered model, and these are models that are going to be trained and created by large companies. It's hard to envision. It's possible, but hard to envision many startups who are creating models at that scale. And if they are spending more than $100 million, at some point you're not some sort of micro garage startup anymore. And so these are huge models that do not exist today, but will exist in the near future. And if you are training and releasing a model of that scale, you have to perform a safety evaluation on the model as you train it, before you release it, using industry standards issued by NIST and other entities. And by the way, every single large AI lab has already committed publicly, repeatedly, to perform these safety evaluations. So we're asking them to do what they have repeatedly committed to do. And if the safety evaluation shows that there is a risk of not small harm, but of a very, very large harm, which we define as doing $500 million in damage or more to critical infrastructure, or via some sort of cybercrime, or facilitating the creation of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, or similarly scaled catastrophic harms, then you have to use reasonable care to try to reduce that risk. Not to eliminate the risk, life is about risk, but you have to take reasonable steps. And if you do not perform that evaluation, and the evaluation does have to be audited, then and your model contributes to one of these massive catastrophic harms, then the Attorney General can sue you. Not private lawsuits, the Attorney General only. And so that's the gist of the bill. There are other pieces. For example, if the model that you create is in your possession, you have to have the ability to shut it down. Not if you release it. If you open source the model and other people have possession, you're not responsible for shutting those models down. It's only what's in your possession.
Let's talk about that 10 million fine-tuning number. If someone's spending $10 million, company's spending $10 million to fine-tune a model, how did you set that number? That became a controversial figure earlier in the week when we were discussing this with a Berkeley professor saying, that could be actually any number of startups spending that much money.
The reason that we put the fine-tuning piece in, and fine-tuning, for those who don't know, is if I build a model and then and then let's say I give it to you, or allow you to license you to use it, or I open source it, and then you take the model and you change the model, you make adjustments to it. At some point, it's no longer the original model. It's been changed sufficiently that the original developer should no longer be responsible for it. And we did that. It was part of the conversations we had with the open source community. And so, folks wanted better definition of what is what we call a derivative model, meaning that you've done a smaller amount of fine tuning, so it's still essentially the original model, or what is now a new model. and we set a few thresholds, but the main one is that you had to spend at least $10 million fine-tuning the model. And as I understand it, and I understand what Professor Stoika said, that you could have someone spend more than $10 million, but overwhelmingly, when you have, let's say, particularly startups, because that's how we want to protect startups and the ability to innovate, overwhelmingly when startups are fine-tuning a large model, they are spending exponentially less than $10 million. It could be hundreds of dollars, thousands, maybe in some instances a few million, but they're not spending $10 million. And if you are spending more than $10 million to fine-tune a model, you are not, again, I'll use the phrase again, some garage startup somewhere. That is a large, sophisticated organization that absolutely has the capacity to conduct safety evaluation. And I want to it's always important to remind people that whether you're hitting the $100 million threshold for the original model creation or the $10 million in fine-tuning, we're simply asking for safety evaluation and the ability to shut the model down. These are not unreasonable requests. These are people have the ability to do this. The large labs have already committed to do it. If you are spending at that level, you absolutely have the ability to conduct a basic safety evaluation.
And as you know, your bill has become such a flashpoint for controversy, even though many in the AI industry, essentially every AI executive out there, everyone in the industry has said, yes, regulation should happen for this. AI is going to be incredibly powerful one day. We should do safety testing. We should have regulation. So why do you think your bill has actually drawn so much scorn?
That's a really important question, and you're absolutely. This is the classic example of please regulate us. All the CEOs have been running around saying, please regulate us. We have to regulate it. Some even signed the letter for the 6-month moratorium on all AI development, which is not something that I support. But please regulate us, just not this regulation.
So you think everyone's being a baby, basically, now that push comes to shove?
I don't think they're being a baby. I think they're being very sophisticated in that they simply do not want regulation. And so, as I mentioned when you and I spoke the other day at that AI conference, if we had put out 20 different versions of the bill with a huge spectrum, they would have a reason to hate every single one of them. There would always be a reason to say, of course we want regulation. Absolutely, it's common sense we want regulation, just not this regulation. And that's why I will say I'm very appreciative of the companies, the organizations that worked with us constructively, like Anthropic, like GitHub, like certain startups, but that actually, even if they said, they were actually saying, we think regulation is important and we want you to make these changes. And we worked with them and made changes, as opposed to some folks who were just like, no, 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 which they have every right to do. But it clearly sends a signal they just want no regulation whatsoever, despite the power of this technology. This is the only industry that seems to get away with like, no, you can't regulate us because you'll destroy our industry. That is not true. There are many, many other industries that use a lot of technology that are heavily regulated and are doing just fine.
So can you detail a little bit about the conversations that you had with industry and other stakeholders that led to the updated versions of the bill that eventually passed the legislature?
So we introduced the full version of the bill in early February. We and since then, and it accelerated in late April. A huge number of meetings. My team probably had hundreds of meetings. I had a large number myself, and this was with large tech companies, startups, venture capital firms, academics. I mean, just the spectrum, and so we had, I mentioned GitHub. When we were working with folks in the open source space, GitHub, which did not take a position on the bill, was incredibly collaborative in working with us on, because I'm not looking to squash open source. That was a false narrative about the bill. This is going to hurt open source. It's not going to hurt open source, and that's important to me. So we wanted to make sure that if there was anything that needed to be drafted in a different way, and we worked with GitHub and others in the open source space and made some significant amendments to in response to that feedback. We worked extensively with Anthropic. Anthropic submitted a public letter saying we want to support the bill. Here are 2 pages of amendments that we think are important. We accepted a majority of Anthropic's amendments, either in full or in a modified form. There were some amendments we just didn't agree with, but most of them we were able to accept in one form or another, and that led to Anthropic submitting a letter not taking a formal position, but stating that the bill on balance was good, that it was implementable, that the risks at issue are real, and that Congress was unlikely to act. We worked with Meta. Meta was constructive. We did not reach any kind of agreement with them, but we appreciated their engagement. Microsoft engaged. We met with various academics. So it was a good process.
Did you meet with Sam Altman personally?
I spoke with Sam early on about the bill, and OpenAI, their team met with my team numerous times, and ultimately, and I want to say that I appreciate this about OpenAI, because OpenAI and Sam have been very vocal about the need for safety and safety evaluations. OpenAI, when they ultimately opposed the bill, OpenAI did not come out against the substance of the bill, right? Unlike some other organizations, they did not say, "Oh, this is impossible," which, sometimes when some others would say that, it rang hollow because they had literally committed to doing what we were asking them to do. OpenAI did not do that. OpenAI simply said this should be handled at the federal level. I agree with OpenAI that it should be handled at the federal level. The question is, will it be handled at the federal level? And Congress, unfortunately, when it comes to tech policy, has not enacted any significant tech regulation since the 1990s other than banning TikTok. So I just don't see that happening. And I hope I'm wrong, because if the governor signs this bill, Congress next year could preempt us. And if Congress were to just like when I authored California's net neutrality law in 2018, I welcomed Congress to preempt the law, which they haven't done 6 years later. Same with our data privacy law. But they have the ability to do that. And if they do it, great. But I'm skeptical.
So Congress has not yet done anything on this issue, but NIST did come out just in the days after the bill passed. NIST came out with agreements with OpenAI and Anthropic to have access to their models in advance to do things like safety testing. Yeah. And this was actually one of your largest points, that the federal government isn't taking action. But that is federal action from an agency that does regulate various cybersecurity issues. So how do you respond to that there is some movement on the federal level?
It's great, and I'll get into that, but it's not binding action. It's purely voluntary. And I commend OpenAI and Anthropic for putting their money where their mouth is and giving NIST and giving the federal government that access as a matter of national security. And so that's fantastic. I'm proud that these are San Francisco companies that are taking safety seriously and actually taking action to do that. And NIST is also putting out standards for safety testing and so forth. All of that is amazing. It's purely voluntary, and OpenAI or Anthropic in 3 years, if they have different management that happen not to prioritize safety as much, could stop doing that. And there's no enforceable way for NIST to compel any company to do that. So that's all amazing, and I support it 1,000%. But it's not an act of Congress that would require that. And so we do need those binding standards to make sure that safety is actually being considered, and not just by OpenAI and Anthropic, but by all of the major labs that are building these incredibly powerful models that will benefit society and could create harm.
Can you explain a little bit about the regulatory teeth that your legislation would have if there's something that creates harm in one of these models, and how is it different than what happens today? If somebody were to, say, create some sort of biological weapon, that is obviously illegal and can be prosecuted and regulated at that point too.
Yeah. So if someone uses a model to do harm, to shut down the electric grid, or do it deepfake revenge porn, or whatever the case may be, there are laws or should be laws to hold those individual bad actors accountable. What we're talking about here is figuring out if there is a way for the design of the model to make it harder, reduce the risk of someone being able to create that harm. It's always better to prevent the harm than to put someone in jail for committing the harm when people's lives have been upended as a result. And so that's really what we're talking about, trying to prevent the harm from happening in the first place.
But right now, if those harms were to happen tomorrow, or let's say the governor decides to veto the bill next week, et cetera, can the government take any action at this point?
Yeah, so I neglected to answer that part of your question. So right now, what we have is a very undefined system of tort law. So it's just standard liability law for negligence, recklessness, intentional bad behavior that harms people. And that's why one of the things I try to point out to folks who oppose the bill to say, oh my God, the bill creates very narrow liability. But liability, what I say is you already have the risk of liability. The law is very unsettled right now, and I think we're going to see in the coming years a lot of lawsuits around AI models that contribute in some way to some sort of harm, and you'll see litigation, and it's going to work its way through the courts in California, other states, probably in federal court, and it could take years and years to figure out. But there is litigation risk, right now, where a model developer will not even know what the courts are going to say about their responsibility and what they can do to avoid that exposure. What this bill says is that if you train and release one of these huge models, and if it contributes to one of these catastrophic harms, then no private lawsuits, but the Attorney General can sue you for doing that. And we know that when you focus enforcement in one elected official and one agency, the Department of Justice, that those lawsuits are going to be very focused. It's not going to be suing people willy-nilly. It's going to focus on the most extreme situations. And so the liability that we're creating, it's very knowable. We're very clear about what you need to do to avoid that liability. And so we think it actually helps focus people on what they need to do to try to protect themselves. And right now, in terms of whether a government agency can sue someone now, maybe, but maybe not. And it's similar to what I said about tort law before, that it'll be all unsettled and it's going to take years to work out.
It sounds like you're trying to avoid a scenario that the crypto industry has felt that they've been in for a while, which what I often hear from people there is we're getting all these speeding tickets without actually knowing what the speed limit is.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why passing smart regulation is important, because you can actually send a signal of this is what we expect of you, and I wish that. And that's why I'm appreciative of the folks who worked with us, and I wish that the folks who just opposed us and spread misinformation online had been more willing to say, hey, let's come up with something smart here, which can be beneficial not just to the public, but to the industry as well.
We are the San Francisco Standard, so I want to make sure we also touch on the implications for this city, which has become the global hub for all things AI. And, downtown has had a tough recovery period post-pandemic, but the bright spots are in AI office space. And basically almost all the mayoral candidates for the city at this point have come out and said that they feel your bill would squash this nascent industry that is giving the economy some degree of buzz right now. How do you respond to that?
They're wrong. I disagree. Having been in very, very tough, heated races before, having been in very close elections before, I do understand the pressures as a candidate to sometimes take positions, and so I don't criticize any of them. Excuse me. I don't criticize any of them for taking those positions. Those positions, in my view, are completely and utterly baseless. I have worked incredibly hard to try to support San Francisco's recovery from the pandemic, including downtown. I've authored numerous excuse me. I've authored numerous various laws to try to help that recovery. I've supported other efforts, and so I am a real cheerleader for San Francisco, and I want downtown to recover. Passing a law to require huge tech companies to perform an evaluation to make sure that their model isn't going to melt down the banking system or isn't going to result in a chemical weapon being detonated, that is not going to undermine downtown San Francisco's recovery, and I think it is completely bogus to say that it will. And I say that with respect to all those candidates, most of whom are my friends.
I'm going to talk to some of the audience questions. Won't this be a kind of negative incentive for companies setting up shop, AI companies setting up shop here, or a sort of push to get them to move outside of this market and set up their companies elsewhere?
The bill is not. This is a really important point. SB 1047's applicability is not based on where you're creating your model. If you want to move to Miami to develop your AI model, I wouldn't want to do that. I'm personally not a fan of Miami, and I think San Francisco is profoundly a better place, than Miami is. But if you want to go to Miami and do that, you can do that, but you will still be covered by the law as long as you're doing business in California. So unless you're going to say, not only am I moving to Miami to train and my model and to be headquartered there, but I'm not going to do any business in California, that's just not real. That is made up. It's the fifth largest economy in the world. It's the epicenter globally of the tech sector. You are not going to be able to avoid doing business in California. And if you do business in California, you're governed by the law. So the law has nothing to do with where you're headquartered, where you're doing your training, where you're physically located. It is whether you're doing business in California. And that's why the argument that this is going to push tech companies out of California is completely frivolous and specious. Just like it was frivolous and specious in 2018 when California passed a data privacy law, because once again, Congress wasn't acting, and you had companies that were basically like grabbing people's personal data and monetizing it in a really abusive way. So we passed a data privacy law, and they said the same thing. You're going to push all the tech companies out of California. You're going to squash innovation. It did no such thing. 6 years later, we're doing just fine. And the same is true here. So I understand from an industry perspective, it's a tried and true argument. You're going to kill off the goose that laid the golden egg, and you're going to push us out if you dare to regulate in the public interest to protect people from profound harms. If you dare to protect society, so the idea that we wouldn't have basic, simple regulations to protect public health and safety, it just makes no sense to me. But I understand the propaganda that gets put out about that.
So I'm going to key on your propaganda. You used the term misinformation a couple of times, and that's gone, various statements have been made about the bill on social media and elsewhere. What sort of misinformation have you seen out there about what the bill does, and maybe you can explain what the bill doesn't do? Actually.
Yeah, so we've seen some misinformation, largely by certain investors, particularly at one particular firm whose lead partner name begins with an A. A lot of statements about startup founders are going to go to prison. That was a real winner because the bill had a provision in it that if when you certify you've done testing, if you lie, if you literally fabricate, that is perjury. And so they turned that into, this is going to send startup founders to prison, which is ridiculous. We ended up removing that from the bill because it wasn't necessary. It's inherently a crime to lie to the government, right? If you lie on your driver's license application or on your tax return, that is that's a crime, regardless of whether there's a specific provision that says that. So we took that out because it was generating conspiracy theories and misinformation. So that was one. Literally telling founders you're going to go to prison. The other one was stating that that the bill requires you to certify that your model will not cause harm. And saying, how could you possibly know that with certainty? The bill does no such thing. It requires a safety evaluation and then taking reasonable care to try to reduce the risk. It's not any kind of like you have to certify that there will not be any harm. In addition to the fact, for both of these things, the prison argument and the certification argument, startups are not covered by the bill. They don't have to provide any of these certifications unless they're spending at least $100 million. There was also the ability to be able to shut down your model. It was never the case in the bill that we were requiring you to be able to shut down a model that's no longer in your possession. But after getting feedback, we realized that needed to be clearer. So we made an amendment months ago to make that clear. And yet we still saw statements that people were going to have to be able to shut down models that they had open sourced and were no longer in their control. So those are a few things. There are some others as well, but those were some of the greatest hits.
Have you gotten any indication on where the governor stands yet?
No. I've learned over time the hard way never to predict or make assumptions about what the governor will do. I've sometimes now with two governors, I get surprised in both directions. So I don't know. He made some statements at the Commonwealth Club a few months ago, statements that I agree with, where the governor said, this is an industry that has said they should be regulated, and we want to make sure that we are not over-regulating and thus harming innovation. Those are statements that I fully agree with, but he has not said where he is on this bill.
And if he were to veto it, how would you respond to that? Would you try again another time? Would you simply move on because this has been such a source of divisiveness within your own party?
It depends, because if he were to veto it, and we're working really hard to convince him to sign it, but if he were to veto it, there are different kinds of veto messages. Sometimes there are veto messages that say, I disagree with this, and I'm not signing this, and then it makes it hard to come back. There are other veto messages that say, I can't sign this bill, but if you do it in a different way, or I want to work with you on a different version, then I could sign it. And in that case, we would immediately get to work, we would look exactly what he said, and we would have the option of then trying to work with the governor and figure out what he could sign. One thing I won't do is if there were a veto message that was asking for a kind of bill that I thought would not be effective, I don't want to do performative legislation. And so what I'm not going to do is put my name on a bill so that we can say we're doing AI safety regulation, but that does not actually accomplish that.
You said you're working hard to get the governor's office to be in the pro direction on this. What does that look like?
Well, we have a big coalition behind the bill, and so supporters of the bill, just like in the legislative process, submit letters of support to the governor. I can't say this with certainty, but I am confident the governor is, I imagine, getting calls from people he knows, pro and con, and I just know that on big bills that often happens. The governor's been around. I think a lot of people know how to get in touch with him. He's a very connected person, which is one of the things that I personally like about the governor. He interacts with people, so I'm sure he's getting an earful from both sides.
Why do you think this bill has been so divisive within your own party? I mean, Ro Khanna has come out against it. Nancy Pelosi has come out against it. London Breed, who you're close with, has come out against it.
I mean, yes, a small number of Democrats have come out against it. The vast majority of Democrats in the California legislature voted for it. So the people who actually had to cast a public vote on it, large majority of Democrats in the California legislature and a few Republicans voted for the bill. About a half a dozen members of Congress have come out against it out of 12, or 14. I can't remember how many Democrats. I should know this. But more than 200 Democrats in the House, and about a half a dozen came out against it. We actually have, about 40 or around 40 Democrats in the California congressional delegation, and the vast majority did not come out against the bill. I have great respect for Speaker Emerita Pelosi and for the other members who came out against it, and they're entitled to their opinion. I respectfully disagree.
I actually want to move to a kind of not well-discussed part of the bill. It's Cal Compute, a kind of a public cloud computing resource, which is an interesting thing that I haven't really seen before. It's in the kind of the controversy and the conversation about the bill, it's often not a point that gets brought up.
Yeah, so Cal Compute is a piece of the bill that has been much less controversial. In fact, there are folks who oppose the bill but say they support that portion. It creates a sort of a public-private partnership that will be situated, the goal is at the UC, that'll create sort of cloud compute access for academics, startups, others to be able to innovate. One of the challenges that smaller players in this space have is just getting access, affordable access to compute, and this will help with that. And so it is, obviously it'll have to be funded. We have a budget deficit now. There could be private and public contributions to it, but I think it's a potentially really exciting thing for California.
What do you think is the biggest misconception you want to clear up right now about this bill while we're in the waiting period?
That it does not require two things, that it only applies if you're spending more than $100 million. So, there are few, if any, startups that are even going to be covered by this. Number two, that it is not going to impair open source in any way, because right now the only, Meta, which is like the king or queen of open source because they open source Llama, Meta has already agreed to do this testing, and so the idea that requiring the testing is going to prevent them from open sourcing their models is absurd. So it's not going to harm open source. And for the models that are covered, it does not require the developer to guarantee or certify that the model will not cause harm. We're not asking for a guarantee. It's simply about doing an evaluation of risk and then taking reasonable steps to reduce that risk, not to eliminate the risk.
That they put in a good try, basically.
Yeah, and exercise reasonable care, which is and we actually changed the way we phrase that duty to reasonable care, because that is existing liability law that people understand, and that was a request that Anthropic and others made, and we made that change.
So something that came up in the conversation we had about this bill earlier this week with Professor Ian Stoica, who's a co-founder of Databricks, so obviously he knows a lot about AI, and also a professor at Berkeley. He said, in regulating other industries, such as the car industry, we don't look at how much money do they spend manufacturing these cars, and various measures of that sort to decide whether or not a company should be pushed into implementing safety measures that seem adequate. Yeah. Why would we do that in the AI industry?
With all respect, I have a lot of respect for Professor Stoica. He's done brilliant guy, done great work. That is a terrible argument. So yes, for cars, we require safety testing before you release it on every single car in existence. And so if Professor Stoica is suggesting that we expand SB 1047 to any and all models, so you have to do it even if you're spending, $10,000 to train a model, and to sweep in every startup and everyone who's doing any kind of AI model construction, I don't think that he would support that. So that is classic whataboutism. Just sort of let's find every way that you can attack a bill. We put in the $100 million threshold because those are the largest, absolute most powerful models. And so you need to put the threshold somewhere. We thought $100 million with a good faith approach. And this is, this is not like comparing, a truck to a car. This is exponential, right? It's probably more like comparing a car to a space cruiser in Star Wars, right? That kind of, which we would probably, if we ever have space cruisers in Star Wars, that we would probably treat that very differently than we treat a car in terms of safety testing. And so that's why we have a threshold, and you have to set the threshold somewhere. We set it high, and we did that intentionally because we were talking about the largest, most powerful models that could truly change the world.
And the cost of training AI models is expected to just go up and up and up over the years, get more and more expensive. So in setting this threshold, I understand you have inflation increases worked in, but how do you know that this is the right threshold for 2 years from now if the cost goes up more than anyone expected?
Well, we put the money threshold in because initially the bill, the only threshold was 10 to the 26th flop. And we got all sorts of criticism about that because, that you could end up with smaller models that are incredibly powerful, and people thought that was not the right factor to have as the sole factor, which is why we put the $100 million in. Over time, you can always change a law. If in 5 or 10 years they look and they say, the $100 million is wrong, it should be $40 million or it should be $400 million, the legislature can change that. Now that's also, when you talk about regulation, you're also striking the balance between putting standards in statute versus authorizing an agency which can be more nimble to implement regulations and be able to change them over time. When you put it in statute, you're going to get criticized for having a standard in statute, which you then have to change through a legislative process. But if you then delegate to an agency, then people get upset because they don't know what the agency is going to do because it's not defined in the statute, and maybe they don't trust the agency. So we had an agency that we created here, the Frontier Model Division, FMD, and that was probably the most hated part of the bill, that people did not want to have a new agency. And so we ended up getting rid of the FMD and instead just vesting limited authority to administer the bill within an existing agency. And so I think on balance, we decided that it was appropriate to be more explicit within the law itself. And if that needs to be changed in the future, it can be changed in the future.
We've been talking obviously a lot about this common sense regulation to kind of, in your sort of terminology, common sense regulation on the industry. Are there also legislative efforts to actually help continue to foster the AI industry in a place like California, which is sort of becoming this center for what could potentially be a world-changing technology?
Well, Cal Compute, which we talked about, and I think there are some other bills, and honestly I can't remember which, because some made it to the governor's desk, some didn't. I don't have the tally in my head because it started with like 50 AI bills and it was down to like 20. But there were a few other bills that tried to move in that direction too. One thing I will say though is, California leads on AI innovation, and if we can also have California lead on smart, thoughtful, non-heavy-handed regulation around safety, around algorithmic discrimination, around deep fakes, around all of these various issues. If we can actually get California to lead on smart, thoughtful regulation of AI, that becomes a virtuous circle that actually puts California even further in the lead in terms of being the epicenter of AI innovation, because AI innovation is not only about creating the models and the uses of those models. It's about what are the constraints and guardrails and thoughtful pro-innovation guardrails that we put around this technology. And I think it just creates a virtuous circle that says California is where it's at. Not only are we building the models and a lot of the applications of these models, but we are also setting up the infrastructure because Congress on technology policy is paralyzed. So I think it's good for California and it's good for the industry here.
So are you thinking about those topics during the next legislative session? Or are you?
No, I don't have anything specific in mind, but and I don't want to just do bills. I don't do bills for the sake of doing bills. When there's a good idea, I take a look at it. But I know that, for example, my colleague Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, assembly member from the East Bay, she's for several years now has been trying to pass an algorithmic discrimination bill because we're going to see AI models, algorithms that are going to make more and more decisions about our lives, about where we're allowed to live, what loan we're allowed to get, what jobs, what apps you can, are eligible for, and so on and so forth. I think there's some apprehension about what that means. And you can have algorithms that are less discriminatory than human beings who make decisions, or more so. And so she's been working really hard on that issue. Her bill got a little tripped up this year, and I don't speak for her, and I don't want to, she has not said this to me, but I would be surprised if she didn't try again next year, and I hope she tries again next year because it's an important issue.
So I think we're getting to the end of our time here. Scott, is there any other point that you wanted to make, or any last sort of closing statement on this as we sort of await the governor's decision?
No, I think that this has been a really, it's been an interesting I've learned a lot about the politics of AI and the accelerationists versus the altruists. It's a little bit like the Jets and the Sharks in West Side Story. But what I've also really seen is that there's a lot of caricaturing happening, that some of the folks on the accelerationist side will say that anyone who is focused on AI safety is a doomer. And you have
a decel is the word, I believe.
Yes, a decel.
A decelerator.
And then you have folks on the more altruist or safety-minded side who will characterize anyone on the accelerationist side as like a reckless libertarian who doesn't care about society. We know that most people are in the middle, and what I've seen, when I introduced the bill, I didn't know what the reaction would be within tech world in San Francisco, because I represent a massive number of folks in tech in one way or another, and I was a little apprehensive, and it turned out that the vast majority of people that I spoke with or who came up to me were there were some who were strongly supportive, some strongly opposed, but overwhelmingly they were just wanting to learn more and being thoughtful about it, and maybe had some concerns but understood what we were trying to do. And so it really actually gave me a lot of hope in terms of the folks who are working in tech innovation around AI and otherwise, that there are so many people in the tech sector who want to do the right thing. And so I view this bill and others as giving people the tools to ensure that the right thing is happening.
I did want to ask one thing, just the strangeness of Elon Musk, who has obviously been a bit of a controversial figure in terms of his relationship with you, coming out in support of the bill. What did you think about that?
It was interesting. I mean, yes, Elon can't stand me, and I can't stand Elon. He's said some very disparaging things about me on Twitter, and I've been very critical of him. But Elon has been very consistent over time in supporting AI safety. He's super consistent, and so I actually really appreciate that he could put aside his dislike of me and look at the substance of the bill and say that it was a good bill. And actually, when one of his MAGA supporters responded to him and said, "How could you support a Scott Wiener bill?" he replied and he said, "I know it's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's a good bill." I was glad that he came out for it, because he represents such a different perspective than I do on so many issues. And I think it really, a lot of people in tech who were skeptical of the bill took note and took a fresh look at the bill. And so I know some people who were really aggressively opposed to the bill who are now saying like, "Oh, I don't love the bill, but it's not it's not going to be that, problematic, and we'll be able to deal with it." And so I think Elon coming out did scramble things up a little bit in a positive way. It got people to really think about, wait, am I overreacting against this bill?
Funny place to end, but we're getting to the end of our time here. Thank you for the audience, and thank you for our panelists here for joining us today to talk about this.
Thank you so much.